teacher. I believe it was Mr. Danny. And we said, how far is too far with your girlfriend? And Danny gave us an answer. And, we weren't very happy with that answer. So then we went and asked a youth minister, right? And the youth minister gave us a different answer. And then I went and asked Uncle Grant. No, he gave me good advice. But I kept asking people because what did I want? What was I hoping they would provide me with? Yeah, I was hoping they would tell me where a line was so I could know I'm not doing anything bad and I could get as close to that line as possible, right? And I wouldn't have to worry about guilt or making mistakes, but I also could be as close to that as I wanted to be. Now, that same sort of principle comes along in lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of our moral lives. We imagine sometimes that God gives us all the rules we need to know how to live well. Let me ask you this. Does the Bible talk about modesty and the importance of modesty? Yes. A lot or a little? Just a little. Does that mean it was not important? Of course it's important. All right, good. What does the Bible say about modesty? How should a person dress? Maybe it's problematic, but it actually only addresses modesty in regards to women in the New Testament. Now, maybe David dancing before the Lord in his underwear is an example in the Old Testament. But Paul has some explicit commands about modesty for women in the New Testament. And he gives a general principle, let the women be modest. And then he gives some specific rules, right? And I'm curious, how many of y'all in the room like those rules? Okay, all right. We got a room full of Bible class students who don't like the Bible. I see how y'all are. He says, don't wear gold jewelry. I'm glancing about this morning, and I'm trying to see who's got their gold on. He says, don't braid your hair. But we read that and we say what? We say, what Paul means is, in his cultural context, for those people at that time, gold jewelry was really extravagant, really a big deal, and braided hair like most of the time today, if a woman has her hair braided, what I assume is she's playing sports or trying to keep it out of her head. Out of her face, right? But braiding hair back then was this elaborate, it was the thing you did to catch notice, to be noticed. And Paul's saying, let your adornment be inner life, good works and such. And we say the principle is important, but anybody in here ever try and raise children and help them pick out their clothes? Anybody find it hard to figure out how to say, now that's a little too low or a little too high or a little too tight or a little too whatever? And they say, well, who says? And then you can do your, I'm the mom or I'm the dad. But what if they were good Christians and just said, well, what does the Bible say? What would you be left saying? How much cleavage does the Bible say you can have? How tight, how short can your skirt be? What's the answer? The Bible. Y'all can say, go ahead. What does the Bible say? It says nary a word. It doesn't have a word to say about it. Isn't that right? It doesn't say something. Rather, what God does is something very scary. He tells us exactly right. He says, be modest, be wise, be prudent. But he also gives us freedom. I had a friend, went to church here, and she was raised thinking that if you wore the color red, that was immodest. Red was flashy and exciting and was kind of a sexy color, and she thought it was wrong to wear red. I'm not going to call anybody this morning. But I remember when she told me that thinking, that seems pretty extreme. Anybody think that seems a little extreme? Right? But for her, that was her conviction and her conscience. What was she obliged to do? She needs to follow her conscience. But also, what would you think if she was here this morning and she came in and she looked at my beautiful Aunt Donna over here and said, look at that strumpet, how she's dressed, walking around in that red shirt this morning. Now, what would you think about her? I'll tell you what I would think. I wouldn't stand for it. I wouldn't try and stand up for Aunt Donna because she can take care of herself. But I wouldn't think that'd be appropriate. If Matt got up in the pulpit this morning and said, all you ladies wearing red or need to repent, get on down this aisle and, confess your sins, would that be inappropriate? It would be, and here's why. Because God hasn't authorized us to draw a line there and impose that line on everybody else. Rather, God has given us freedom and said, use it well. That makes us uncomfortable because it means that we have to exercise agency and self-control and wisdom. It's nice when you're driving on the freeway and you've got clear lines exactly where your car is supposed to be and their car is supposed to be. It's difficult when you're driving to Mama's house on West Mississippi Street because it's kind of a narrow road and there ain't no line on it. I think they did put a line on it, didn't they? They put a line on it today, and Jenny goes, look, there's a line on the road. She was so happy. Because before, where are you supposed to drive when there's no line on the road? You're just going to have to be free. So there's a sense in which it's important to note that boundaries do give us room for freedom. But one of the risks that comes, and I'm moving back to, all this stuff has been an analogy for our topic about chemicals and alcohol and drugs. I want to come back explicit to that. God doesn't give us much in the way of hard lines on this topic. There aren't many rules on this topic. He says things like, don't get drunk with wine, but be filled with the Spirit, right? And that seems like a good rule. But who gets to decide what counts as drunk? Is tipsy drunk? Fallen down drunk? Above the legal limit drunk? Well, the text doesn't spell that out, does it? And furthermore, he says don't get drunk on wine. What does he say about marijuana? What does he say about cocaine or Adderall? What does he say about opioids or barbiturates? What's the answer? He doesn't say anything about them. Does that mean, great, let's have a punch bowl party? Oh, punch bowl party is everybody brings their pills. You drop the pills in the punch bowl. Everybody drinks the punch and just see what happens. This is a very bad idea. Do not do this. Brother David. Absolutely. David says, be concerned about how your behavior affects others, not just yourself. And we've read this before. We're going to look, I told you earlier, Romans 14 is one of the passages we want to look at this morning. How do we navigate freedom well? Brother Ben, did I see a comment? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Ben's question was, don't we have science now for like blood alcohol level for driving? What I would say is, that's absolutely correct. Here's a great rule, Christian people. Don't drive with the blood alcohol level above the legal limit. Now, that's an easy line to draw. The government's drawn it for us. I might want to ask, if I'm a state legislature, how do they decide on that exact blood alcohol level? The answer is, like all boundaries like this, it's somewhat arbitrary. But once we decide this is it, it's binding. That's the nature of the law. And it might be, this might be a good, can I introduce a word to y'all this morning? Y'all know I love a big word if we can get one in. Heuristic. You might have heard that word before, a heuristic. A heuristic is like a good rule of thumb. Like here's a heuristic. Measure twice, cut once. Any carpenters in the room know this heuristic? Good piece of advice. Here's a good heuristic. Don't drive above if you have above the legal limit. And you might even say, that blood alcohol limit that says you're impaired to drive, that might be good whether you're driving or not. You might say, I'm not going to cross that even if I'm sitting at home watching TV or I'm at a New Year's Eve party or whatever it is. That might be a heuristic that you follow. Now, when God gives us this call to wisdom and to freedom, that entails, as we've been saying, that entails risk. Now, 2 weeks ago, we had Brother Clay here, and he talked about one of the major risks associated with all these drugs, and that is their addictive properties. That with drugs and alcohol, even addictive drugs, chemical addictions like alcohol or nicotine or things like that that are highly addictive, methamphetamines, okay, those are chemically addictive. But like marijuana that's not particularly chemically addictive is nevertheless, remember what he called it, a process addiction, right? That is, we can still become addicted to the dopamine hit we get with that. The same thing's true for all sorts of things that aren't chemical in nature, like gambling or that sort of thing. Brother David had a good word for us on this. He said, have no other gods before me. And if you're addicted, this is difficult to practice self-control, the addiction practices. We spent a whole week talking about that risk. Last week, we spent a whole week talking about the risk of foolishness. Wine is a mocker. Drugs and alcohol make you act like a fool. How foolish do you want to act? But this week, I do want to talk about another risk that comes along with this. And this is the risk of judgmental, being judgmental. One of the things that happens when you have freedom is you set people up for arguments. Isn't that right? Haven't you ever driven a long way with kids in the car? 2 kids in the back seat of the car? And you have to say, here's the line. You say on your side of the line, you say on your side of the line. Y'all quit bothering each other, right? Why do we do that? Because clear boundaries help prevent disagreements and arguments. They do. But who gets to decide those boundaries? And here's something that's very inappropriate. In my car, on my road trip with my kids, I feel fine to do that. But imagine if you went out to your car, Warren goes out to his truck this afternoon, and I've taken and drawn a line right down the middle of the back seat, and I said, now this is Beckett's side and this is Will's side, and I don't want either one of you crossing it. Warren's a friend of mine, and he might think, oh, that's helpful, but I bet he would say, hey, Mac, why don't you mind your own business, and I'll raise my kids and you raise yours? Is that right, Warren? He might say, yeah, take it over. These boys are too much. We have a responsibility and we have an authority over ourselves. And we have a responsibility and authority over sometimes people who are under our care. Isn't that right? Children, it might be that if you own a business, you might say, look, to the extent that at my business, here's a practice we're going to have. No drinking, while you're on the clock. This is a very common thing in business, isn't it? Right? Okay. We can exercise that authority. But here's something we're not allowed to do as Christians. We're not allowed to be the boss of everybody around us, even if it would be for their own good. I'm going to say that again because that's a hard lesson for us. We're not allowed to be the boss of everybody around us, even if it be for their own good. And when I hear that, that makes me kind of sad because sometimes I think if people would just listen to me, I could tell them how to live their lives. Anybody got a little bit of that in them? But I also think this. God made us in His image and God made us free. And God said, you're going to have both the joy and maturity and the responsibility that comes with exercising freedom in a risky world. And just as many Christians have gone too far and become alcoholics or become fools or become addicts because of their overindulgence in drugs and alcohol, right? So also, and this is the truth, many Christians have overstated what the Bible teaches on this. We've been so scared of those legitimate, scary risks that we've stopped doing what is, in our tradition, what has been a kind of clarion call. That is, let's just say what the Bible says. And does the Bible always say that drinking alcohol is wrong? No. Far from it. The Lord drank alcohol. We say, let's be like Jesus, except not in this way. Now, my point is not to say to you this morning, be like Jesus. Go make 150 gallons of wine at a wedding and partake. That's not my point. My point is, if you're out there and you're saying, alcohol is always an evil for everyone, and you look askance, you judge your brother and your sister when they partake in it, recognize that you're judging Jesus Christ, our moral example. Matthew chapter 7 says what? Right there in the first verse. Judge not, lest you be judged. Right? It's not your job to go around and judge everybody. What does she say? Oh, yes. Okay, yeah. Just talk a little bit louder, Mom, because Lisa can't hear you back there in the back. Now, here's what I think about this kind of topic. Our temptation to avoid real risk, dangerous risk, and thereby fall off on the other side is very, very real, isn't it? Do you find that most people are pretty good at finding the right balance on things? In my life, I don't. I know my instinct is, if I see this danger, what do I want to do? Jerk the wheel too hard this way and fall off on the other side. Now, we had the Worshiping Witness here a few weeks ago. Anybody attend that? If you missed those, let me just say, that's a powerful thing we're doing at this church. And if you sat here and you listened to Eric talk about their family and the horrors that alcohol had brought to their family, and you listened to Cliff tell the story that he told about what drugs did in his life, and Josh talking about the pain that had come from this, I walked out of that meeting and I said, I don't want anything to do with any of those chemicals, because I could see the very real risk, right? And I'll tell you this, I don't drink. Matter of fact, this morning I was thinking about this, and I just thought, I am so glad that in my particular life, I've never been in a situation where alcohol was a part of my life. I'm really grateful for that. I love that. But that doesn't mean I get to condemn other people who have a different scruple than I have. Or that I get to look down on people who drink responsibly. Or that I get to say, now look, this has worked for me, you ought to do the same thing. And tell them how to live their life. Go over to Romans 14. I want you to hear what Paul says here. Really important passage for this topic. As for the one, I'm beginning in verse 1. And I'll wait, I still hear a few pages turning. Oh, by the way, this is neither here nor there. I just have been looking for an excuse to mention this. Lots of us, we don't turn pages in our paper Bible. We're using our phones or iPads for Bibles these days, and that's great. But sometimes they have that really annoying thing where you push the button and it starts reading it out loud in church. And that can, I was in a meeting the other day and that happened, and the lady I was sitting with was so embarrassed. She started pushing that phone. If that happens, the quickest way to stop it is just push that volume button on the side of your phone down, and it'll go down. So some people just didn't, they were asking about that. That's a good little tip. All right. Mom, Dad's not here this morning, but if you'll mention that to him, that would be a good thing. Tracy, I just got a little bit hotter. Did you turn me up by accident? I'm not sure. Maybe just watch the volume there. Romans 14, chapter 1. As for the one who is weak in faith, welcome him, but not to, what language do you have here? What's your word? Mine says quarrel. What word do you have? Say it again, Miss Sheila. Who's doubtful, but he says, welcome the one who's doubtful, but not in order to, and then maybe something like fight, quarrel, argue. What do you have, Brother Ben? Pass judgment, not to dispute with him over opinions. One person believes he may eat anything. Another person, the weak person, he says, eats only vegetables. Is it okay to eat meat? For Christians, is it okay to eat meat? In general, for most Christians in most places, most of the time, it's okay to eat meat. And I give God glory for that because I like to eat meat, right? But he says at Rome, there are some brothers and sisters who do not eat meat. They only eat vegetables. Is this like a health thing for them? Is that why they're doing it? Shake your head like this. Why are they refraining from meat? That's right. Brother Carroll's exactly right. They say this. Look, in our culture, in Rome, most of the butcher shops where you'd go and get meat were associated with temples, and temples to false gods. And they say, you know what? I don't want to buy meat and take into my body meat that was set on the table of a false god. I don't have to do with these false gods. Or, that we know that's what's going on at Corinth. At Rome, it might be this. Jews in the church who say, some meats are kosher, some meats are not kosher, but all vegetables are kosher, safer just to eat vegetables only. Now, tell me the truth. How many of you would say, my instincts or how I was raised or whatever, that seems like the kind of religious logic that I grew up with or have in me? I don't know if this is okay. Better safe than sorry. Anybody heard better safe than sorry as a religious principle? Okay. Sometimes that's a really good, appropriate one, isn't it? It's kept me out of some trouble. I actually think there's a lot of truth and wisdom in that. But what does Paul, how does he refer to these better safe than sorry brothers? What does he call them? What word does he use to describe them? Who eats only vegetables? The weak. The weak. Now, we want to be careful here, because are we supposed to judge the weak or look down on the weak or argue with the weak? No. But notice Paul does call them the weak. That's not an irrelevant piece of this. All right. Let no one who eats despise or look down on the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. Who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? It's before his own master that he stands or falls, and he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand. Now that's relevant. All this talk about freedom says this: don't judge. That's not your servant, that's the Lord's servant. You let him take care of it. And we know this, right? I got 3 kids, and my oldest son thinks he knows how my youngest son ought to be raised. Anybody have any experience with this? My oldest boy thinks he knows how the youngest boy ought to be raised, and sometimes he wants to jump in and tell, Mark, you're nodding, your oldest daughter had some thoughts about this. I believe it. I probably would listen to her. She's pretty sharp. Elijah's always saying how Judah ought to get a whipping for this and ought to get a whipping for that, and he wants to get in there and just kind of line that brother out. And when that happens, sometimes what do I say? Well, y'all don't know. I say, boy, you ain't his daddy. That's what I say. You ain't his daddy. Mind yourself, right? You take care of yourself. I'll take care of him. If he needs a whooping, I'm the one going to give it to him. Uncle Grant, you don't got no stories about this, about older brothers wanting to whoop younger ones? Who are you always wanting to whip? He'd probably be better off if he'd gotten some from you. Yeah, but you know what? I don't let Elijah whip Judah, because that's not his role. Judah's my son. And Paul says, God does not let you look out there and say to somebody else in the church on a matter in which God has not spoken, here's how you have to do. You don't get that right. Even if, and this is important, even if you're right and they're wrong. That's the hard part, right? We say, well, look, if it's just, chocolate or vanilla, I'm not going to judge nobody exactly. I'm not trying to control nobody on that. But Paul's not talking about just opinions like chocolate. He's talking about opinions that are deeply held religious convictions that these people have. You think they have Bible that they appeal to for these things? They absolutely do. They go back to the Old Testament and they go, look right here. If it's even touched a Gentile, it's unclean. How are you going to get some meat that hadn't touched a Gentile? I'm just trying to do what the Bible says. And Paul says, you're going to have to mind your own business on this. Nobody puts you in charge of that, even if you're right. He goes on. One person esteems one day better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each should be fully convinced in his own mind. Wait, what? Each should be what? Fully convinced in his or her own mind. Now, some of you, can we just ask this? You don't have to answer if you don't want to. Raise your hand if you say, I have a conviction. I don't drink alcohol. I think it's wrong to drink alcohol, and I don't do it. I just see any hands? Okay. A few people, yeah, good. Who says, I don't think it's wrong. Whether I do or not, I don't think it's wrong. I think it's permissible to do so responsibly. So I see hands? All right. Here's what I hope. If you raised your hand the first time, I hope you have good reasons for what you believe and you're convinced in your own mind of it. And I hope you don't judge your brothers. And if you raise your hand the second time, I hope you look around the room and say, I've got good reasons for what I believe, but I'm not looking to disdain or pass judgment on my brothers over this. Because while the Bible is ambiguous about whether alcohol is good, neutral, or bad, whether we ought to drink it or ought not to drink it, or under what circumstances we ought to drink it, it is not ambiguous on the question of whether or not you ought to pass judgment on somebody in regards to what they eat or drink. Paul's actually quite clear about this. He's quite clear about it. And we face a danger when we try and push our convictions on somebody else. We face a danger when we make a bigger deal out of something that God makes out of something. Here's one of the principles I think is pretty important that Jesus seems to emphasize a lot. God gives a lot of rules in the Old Testament, doesn't he? You can say yes, he does. Are they all of equal weight? Are they all equally important? All the rules that God gives. Now this is tricky. I blame Martin Luther for how we feel about this, just for what it's worth. I like to blame Luther for a lot of things, and on this one I just blame Luther. Christian people, especially people who've come out of the Protestant tradition, which would include most of us in this room, and Churches of Christ fall within this tradition. We have this funny idea that all sins are equal. There are no big sins or small sins in God's eyes. All sins are equal. And the reason we tend to have this is because we say, all sins will condemn you. All sins can damn you to hell. Well, amen, that's true. Any sin can do it. But the truth is, that does not mean that all sins are equal. And you'll look near and far in your Bible to find anything that would make you think such. Matter of fact, what you frequently find in the Bible is some sort of ranking. Jesus says to the Pharisees, you tithe mint and dill and cumin. That is, they go out to their herb bush and they count how many leaves of rosemary are growing on each stem. And they go, all right, and I sell rosemary for X amount a pound and 10% of that. And they're counting to give 10% of their rosemary, their cumin, to the temple. They're that careful about their tithes. Jesus says, you tithe mint and dill and cumin and neglect. And then, you know what the language he uses here? The weightier matters of the law. Justice. Right? If I said to you, this is the weightier matter of the law, what does that mean? It means we put them in the balance. One's heavier than the other. That is, one is more important than the other. Would God rather you give 9.6% of your income in tithes and do justice to the poor, or do injustice to the poor and give 10%? This is not a hard question. Now, someone will say, rightly, he wants you to do both, right? The fact that there are big sins and little sins doesn't mean that we have an excuse to engage in little sins because they're little, right? But it's also a huge mistake to imagine that some are not bigger than others. And when we talk that way, we sometimes give the impression that these sins are the big ones. They're the ones that will do the most harm to you. So one of the things I think that's been a real problem with the Christian witness and lots of times in the church's history is that we have exalted particular forms of righteousness or particular sins in such a way that we've given the world and given ourselves the wrong impression about what's really bad. Give an example. When I was a boy, if you asked me, I think this is actually very common with children. if you were to say, what's a sin? One of the first things I would have said is using cuss words. Using cuss words is a bad sin. I didn't want to use those bad words. I find that my children, especially as they just go through at least a phase where they say, ooh, those are bad words. And then they get in puberty a little older and they're like, I'm gonna try out one of those bad words. That's a pretty common sort of phenomenon. When I was a teenager, I thought, man, using bad words, that's a really bad sin. And I would never use a bad word without feeling a lot of guilt anyway. But I would talk to people that I loved, my sister, my mom or dad, or my cousin or my friends. I would talk to them in the most demeaning, hateful tone of voice that I could muster. And I did not think one thing about it. Anybody got a situation like that? Right? Never miss church on Sunday and sleep through it the whole time. One of the things that I think is dangerous when we focus on some small sin is it can blind us to what the bigger sins actually are. We become sort of myopic. We become overly focused. We have a single view that says, well, hey, I'll tell you one thing I don't do. I don't drink and smoke and go to parties. Instead, what I do is sit around and gossip and judge people and just fan the flames of my own pride until I think I'm better than all my neighbors because of what I don't do that they do. Now, which do you think God is going to be more displeased with? This is not a hard question. This is not a hard question at all, right? And so when we're talking about dangers, when we're talking about risks, one of the great problems we have as human beings is we are overly afraid of immediate risks that are highly visible and not afraid enough of slow risks that are largely invisible. Can I give you an example of this? We are afraid of being robbed or murdered. Isn't that right? Isn't that right? We're afraid of being robbed or murdered. People are scared about this. How often does that happen? Very, very, very rarely in our society. But when it does happen, it's going to be on the news. Isn't that right? I mean, we're going to hear about it. And so we're anxious and afraid that someone might kill us in that way. We're afraid of murderers and violent crime. Here's what we are not afraid of: fast food. Which kills more people in this country? I mean, it's not close, y'all. It's not close at all. Why aren't we scared of fast food? Why don't those golden arches send shivers down our spine? Okay, good. Sheila says it tastes good. Now, we might disagree about that, Miss Sheila. I don't eat that at McDonald's, but I'm snobby on that food. It tastes good. It's slow, right? I was listening to Willie Nelson sing this week. Willie said, what you want to bet one more cigarette won't kill you? And what's the answer? One more cigarette won't kill you. But you won't just have one more, will you? Right? It's the slow progression. How about this one? We teach our children. I was in a lesson the other day, and they were talking about what to call the Good Samaritan, and they were trying to figure out some way to say, the teacher was trying some way to say he was a foreigner without teaching people to be, like racist, or he was a stranger. But he said, but I don't want to call, he was teaching his kids about it, his little kids. And he said, I didn't want to say stranger because, we don't want to teach them to talk to strangers. I just thought about that for a second. How many of y'all think that's important to teach kids? Don't talk to strangers. Because we're afraid that if they talk to strangers, some stranger might be a bad person who would, what would they do, Mama? What's the word? Get them. Mama always says, someone might get them. And I always say, what will they do? What does that mean? She goes, I don't know, but they'll get them. We teach them not to talk to strangers because we're afraid they might get kidnapped or abused or murdered or whatever, right? But we're not afraid that they might grow up suspicious of their neighbors and isolate themselves and be so plugged into their themselves that they are terrified of other people and therefore lose a community. Now, which is more likely to happen, and which is the greater danger that we're actually facing? Well, I would submit this to you this morning as we're closing out here. There are real risks of addiction, and there are real risks of foolishness, acting foolish, that come with alcohol. There are real health risks associated with drugs and alcohol. It is actually very risky. And there are also real risks that come with focusing so much on those other risks that we become judgmental. Or we give the world the impression that we think our faith is not about proclaiming the good news of the resurrection of Jesus, but rather about some sort of morality policing. And being a Christian is defined by avoiding this or that social practice. Now, I want you to, I'm going to close this out, but I want you to, as we sit here, to think, which of those dangers is greater in my life? Which is the greater threat to me? One's invisible. Most people won't notice that they become judgmental and proud. It happens slowly. It's an inner disposition. We won't notice how often we look down on and judge other people. It might be that the risk of addiction or foolishness in regards to alcohol and drugs is very acute, very sharp, very big with you. If that's the case, you better be wise. You better be paying attention. You better make good, godly decisions. But some of us need to be thinking about this other risk, that we might be judgmental, that we might major in the minors, that we might neglect the weightier matters of the law because we're so concerned and afraid on these other ones. That's what it is to be free people. We're going to pick it up next week, and we'll be wrapping this series up. And then we're going to move on to talk about a really challenging topic. How should Christians feel about mental health? What do we think about mental health? And that's tied because some of the things we think about mental health has to do with medication, which is chemicals again. We'll start that 2 weeks from today. We'll wrap up drugs and alcohol next week. Thanks you guys for being here.